Okay, everyone, here we are for part 2, and now we're going to start talking about some of our theories. So the first one we're going to talk about is the neuropsychology, and specifically the neuropsychology of offending. Okay, people commit crime under this theory because there's something about them that they've inherited that makes them more likely to commit crime. It's genetically based, but there really is no such thing as a crime gene. Some genes work together that may make it more likely for a person to commit crime, but there is no specific gene. So think about what happened to you when you were in the womb. I'm sure that none of you can remember this, but when you were in the womb, your mother may have drunk alcohol, she may have smoked, she may have taken drugs. I really hope for most of you that's not true, but it does happen. So you have to think about some of the stuff that happened to you and you were exposed to before you were born. So prenatal refers to the period from conception through to birth, while the term perinatal refers to the time around the birth of a child. You could also look at whether the mother had an injury to her belly while pregnant, such as a car accident where the seatbelt pulls really tight. Could also include stress or emotional events that release hormones that could affect the child before birth. But then what happened to you after you were born? You could have had an injury or an illness that affected you. Let's get rid of that again. Okay, so if it is inherited genetically, we should see crime running in families. So if you have a dad that has committed crime, then you should do it too. And do we see crime families? Well, yes, we do see families where the children take after the parents and commit crime too. And it's often really quite rampant. But why? Is it because they have something in them genetically that has predisposed them to commit crime? Is it because criminality is inherited genetically? Or is it more likely because they've grown up in an environment with the influences of the parents where they may have been socialised to grow up to be criminal? So we need to tease the environmental and biological factors apart, which is not always easy to do. And Adrian Raine, who is quoted here, is one of the foremost researchers in this field if you're interested in looking him up. He says that there is something about genetics that can't be ignored, but the role of the environment is still substantial. So some of the studies that they've done involve looking at adopted children. And this is one way to find out if it's due to genetics, is to look at children who are adopted. So they look at the adopted parents, see if they are criminal. And in this study, Crowe looked at the biological mothers of the adopted children and saw the above statistics. So what he really was saying here is that the biological mothers had a criminal record, then 50% of the children went on to have a record. If the biological mothers had no criminal record, then only 5% went on to not be criminal, have a criminal record. But how accurate is this if we haven't also looked at the adoptive parents? So this one is a rather large study. This is a really large sample size. So when you're doing your studies with MyESSA and you start talking about sample sizes, this is a really good one. And he looked at both sets of parents. So here, it was not just about biology, it was saying that environment is important as well. And it's important to note that this was just for property crime and not for violent crime. So if the adoptive parents and biological parents were both criminal, then 24.5% were criminal, but 20% of them were still non-criminal. Okay, so if the adoptive parents and biological parents were non-criminal, then there was a higher suggestion that the children would go on to be non-criminal themselves. So what do all these things mean? What are all these parts of the brain and how do they relate? Well, the prefrontal cortex is the frontal lobe of the brain, and it is now not thought to be fully developed until the mid-20s. And this is the area that concentrates on decision making and the ability to not take risks. So that's why you young ones are more likely to jump out of planes and jump into midair with little bits of elastic around your ankles, because your risk-taking part of your brain may not be fully developed. Executive reasoning, problem solving and social skills are all here. So imagine if you don't have these developed enough in order to avoid violence. The amygdala is the part of the brain that contains fear and the formation of memories relating to events that have caused fear. So this is what's going to fire up if you see danger. So, for example, a person with a fully functioning amygdala could be told a very violent story accompanied by gory pictures and would have a higher recall than someone with damage to their amygdala. This is due to the emotional learning that happens here. The hypothalamus is responsible for certain metabolic processes and linked to the autonomic nervous system. Linked to the pituitary gland, it involves the regulation of hunger, thirst, fatigue, sleep, circadian rhythms, and body temperature, as well as being linked to important aspects of parenting, such as attachment. This is where testosterone and violence come from. And the last one is the hippocampus, one on either side of the brain, and plays an important role in the formation of memories from short-term to long-term, and spatial memory, which aids navigation. It is also involved in the control of emotions and anger. So examples of biological and abnormalities and irregularities related to violence. Irregular functioning of the neurotransmitters can play a very big part in this. So serotonin affects mood, appetite, and sleep, has some cognitive functions such as memory and learning, and is what is affected when a person has depression. So that is why when you take antidepressants, they are giving you serotonin to try and bring you up. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that is affected by reward-motivated behaviour. When rewarded and feeling good, it is dopamine that is released in the brain, which is why it is what is affected by the use of illicit drugs. So if you take illicit drugs to make you feel good, your brain will stop making dopamine by itself, and you have to keep taking more drugs to feel good. I hate trying to say this next word. I'm going to try really hard. Norepinephrine mobilizes the brain and body for action. In fight or flight, it kicks into gear. It's at its lowest level when you are asleep, and it increases when you're awake, and it is at its highest level during stress. And cortisol is what is released in response to stress. Change levels related to major depressive disorder, anxiety disorders, and psychological distress. The levels may also vary for those with autism or Asperger's syndrome. But it's also important to remember that it's not all about environmental factors. It's not all about, get rid of that, biology. It's also about the environment. So there has been a very big link between head injuries and crime, and it does depend where the head injury is, but there is some evidence of a link between a head injury and criminal behaviour. PET scans have been used in court to suggest that perhaps the client should be found not guilty due to reasons of insanity. What type of head injuries are we talking about here? So what might another reason be that people start committing violent crime that is caused by a head injury, even if they have had a head injury before and haven't gone to criminal activity? Well, medications can lead to people having head injuries or problems with their brain that can cause them to start committing crime, as can emotional trauma. There are other reasons that could be a link between a head injury and violent behaviour. What if the person just grew up in a really, really violent atmosphere? And another thing that we will talk about more is the fact that we've got a lot of people who play football who are now in later life having problems. So the person we're going to talk about now is a guy called Phineas Gage. And I just want you to watch that YouTube clip about Phineas Gage, and then we will come back and we will talk about him a little bit more. No, we won't really talk about him a lot, but you can see this is the actual picture of his skull and where this iron bar went through his skull. And as you can see, it has gone through the frontal lobe just there, and that's what caused him to have the personality change. So just listen to the story about Phineas Gage, because it's actually extremely a harrowing experience he went through, but just amazing that he actually even survived it. Okay, so it appears that there may be some genetic influences on offending, but we need to ensure we take the environment into account. If we did identify a biological deficit, could we treat it? How would you feel about giving antibiotics to someone to treat a problem in their brain causing them to go out and commit crime? Should we or could we medicate people to prevent crime? Now we're going to discuss intelligence and crime. Is there a link between how smart you are and whether you're going to commit crime? Well, the theory of offending being related to low intelligence is a compelling one. It's very compelling because the re-imprisonment rate is high. So it's easy to believe that they must not be very smart if they can't stay out of prison. But does a low rate of education relate to low intelligence? Well, not necessarily, because there's a lot of other factors, such as living in a low SES area. Do you think this correlation is high or low? Well, 0.1 is very, very low. The correlations run from 0 to 1, where 0 means no correlation and 1 means a total correlation. So therefore, there must be other factors coming into play, such as the environmental factors. So there are some people who are in prison who are really, really intelligent, but perhaps their parents didn't read to them when they were young. Perhaps their parents didn't invest in their schooling and their education. So that can cause them to be mistaken as being of low intelligence. This is not a popular theory. So low intelligence is not the norm in criminal populations. Low education, definitely, but low intelligence, no. So this is not a theory that is commonly used. I'm going to let you guess to who that lovely person is there who's no longer with us. You should know who he is. You'll come to him. So what is considered to be a high IQ? Well, an average intelligence score is considered to be between 90 to 110. So what is the IQ of some famous serial killers? Well, Rodney Alcala was thought to have killed up to 50 women. That's what he would do to them. You can read that. He had an IQ of 170. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, he was actually a mathematics professor and so had come up with codes that not even the FBI could crack, IQ of 167. Charlene Gallego murdered young females, IQ of 160. Andrew Cunanan, who killed Gianni Versace, could speak 7 languages and had an IQ of 147. Ted Bundy, who was in the photo that we just saw, IQ of 136, very, very smart, wanted to represent himself, wanted to be a lawyer. And so he was a very intelligent man. So anything about 125 is considered to be in the gifted range. But overall, it's considered that most serial killers do not have a really high IQ. These guys and ladies are outside the norm, but it just goes to show there's some very, very smart people there. Okay, that's the end of part 2. We'll move on to some different theories in part 3.